The last time this episode mentioned Völundr, he was a figure out of time, a smith working alone on an island, forging objects of impossible beauty, while the world that had cast him there slowly forgot his name. That telling belonged to Act 4, and it framed Völundr as evidence of something specific, that the elf occupied the heroic register, not the monster register. What Act 4 established in one direction, Act 7 completes in the other. The elf hero and the elf disease belong to the same power class. The tradition kept both. It understood what it was holding. Völundr opens not in a forge, but in a meadow. Three brothers, Slagfidr, Egil, and Völundr, encounter three women spinning flax on a shore, and each takes one for a wife. The poem identifies Völundr's bride by the most specific epithet in the text. She is called a Valkyrie, and she is also called an elf. Or more precisely, the poem's opening formula places her within the same family of powers as the elves, a hint that the boundary between the two registers was not yet sharp in the poet's mind. 9 years pass. Then the women leave. The poem does not linger on the abandonment. It moves directly to the consequence. Egil goes in search of his wife, Slagfidr goes in search of his, and Völundr stays behind on the island of Sevastadr because he has something to do there. What he has to do is make things. The poem gives him the most specific maker title in the entire Eddic corpus. He is Visi Alpha, Lord or Prince of the Elves. Not a smith who happens to be an elf, but the named ruler of that power class. The elves have a recognized hierarchy in this poem. They have a prince. Whatever they are organized enough to need one. Völundr sits at the top of that structure. Then the king who rules the surrounding lands arrives with his men, and the poem's register shifts violently. The king, identified in some manuscript traditions as Nidudr, a figure otherwise attested as a historical Swedish petty king, wants what Völundr makes. He also wants Völundr's wife, though the poem does not say this plainly. What it says is that the king's men find Völundr alone on the island, seize him and hamstring him, cut the tendons in his legs so he can never walk again. Völundr is taken to the king's court and imprisoned. The poem gives no motive beyond possession. It does not need to. In the world the poem records, a king can take a smith and break him for no reason the poem considers worth explaining. The elf prince spends his captivity in the forge. The king takes from him everything except his hands. Völundr's revenge begins where the king's logic ends, by making things the king will value, and filling those things with the king's own undoing. He kills the king's two sons, fashioning from one skull a drinking bowl for the king's table, and from the other a brooch for the queen. The objects are magnificent. The poem takes care to describe them that way. The horror is not that they are crude, it is that they are perfect, and that the perfection is a message. Every time Nidudr drinks from that bowl, he is drinking from his own son. The final move is the one the entire episode has been circling. Völundr makes himself wings, laced with bird down, fitted to arms that the poem describes with the precision of a maker who knows exactly what he is binding together. He straps them on, launches from the tower where he has been held, and flies away. Scholars including Armin Jakobsson and Terry Gunnell have treated this flight as one of the most remarkable images in Norse literature. The smith who was broken on the ground, rising on wings of his own making, escaping not by force, but by craft. The elf who was hamstrung becomes the only figure in Norse myth who flies unaided. The body was destroyed. The craft was not. What Völundr's story does, what the Völundr does with remarkable precision, is place the elf in the heroic register by giving him the structure of a heroic narrative. Exile, suffering, cunning revenge, escape. The elves are not monsters. The poem does not present them as a threat to be fought. It presents Völundr as a prince whose territory has been violated, a smith whose craft has been stolen, a man whose vengeance is measured and exact. The framing is the framing of a saga hero, not a cautionary tale. The elf sits beside the gods, not as their servant, but as their peer in the oldest narrative structures the tradition preserves. But there is another Völundr, and he has been waiting at the edge of this chapter from the beginning of the episode. Before the heroic Völundr takes flight, there is an elf who enters the body through a wound that no knife makes. Elvismal is a poem about a different kind of elf, and what it offers is the most specific thing any Eddic poem says about the elves as a category. They have their own words for the world. When the dwarf Alvisa arrives at Thor's hall, claiming to have come for the hand of Thor's daughter, Thor does not fight him. He traps him in a contest of names, asking the dwarf to identify the earth, the sky, the moon, and the sun as they are called among the elves. In each case, Alvisa gives a different word. The elves have a separate cosmological vocabulary. They live in a world that is the same world the gods inhabit, but their name for it is not the god's name. The elf is not a being without culture. The elf has a language, and the poem records it. The cosmology in Grimnismal 5 says, Alfheim was given to Freya as a tooth gift, a tanfa, a gift given when a child cuts its first tooth. The passage places the elves in geopolitical relation to the Æsir. They are a distinct domain within the same system, not a species living outside it. Freya owns Alfheim. The elves occupy it. The Vanir, the Æsir, and the Alfar are three distinct powers, each with its own territory, each with its own relationship to the cosmic order. This is what the formula Æsir Oke Alpha was recording from the beginning. Not gods and their subordinates, but three coexisting powers, each standing in its own right. Scholars including Alaric Hall, John Lindo, and Terry Gunnell have argued that the elves' cosmological vocabulary in Alvismal, their separate names for the moon, the sea, the sun, is the same register as their separate territory in Grimnismal. The elves are not a biological category, but a cultural and cosmological one. They are a people with a language and a homeland, and what the diseased tradition calls them when it shoots them is not a different creature, but the same power encountered at the wrong boundary. Völuspa stanza 48 asks, how is it with the Æsir? How is it with the elves? Vat me assum, vat me alfum, placing both groups in parallel syntactic positions. Völuspa stanza 48 asks, how is it with the Æsir? How is it with the elves? Vat med assum, vat me alfum, placing both groups in parallel syntactic positions. John Lindo and Terry Gunnell read this early mythological placement not as an artifact of poetic constraint, but as proof that the elves were fundamentally embedded within the highest tier of the Norse cosmos, a status preserved through the skaldic tradition's strictest rules. The syntactic architecture of the oldest Norse poetry does not deploy its terminology by accident. When the skalds repeatedly pair the Æsir with the Alfar, they are documenting a cosmological reality that the original audience understood without requiring additional exposition. This rhythmic durability indicates that the pairing served as an anchor for their mythological memory, surviving oral transmission across multiple generations before ever being committed to parchment. In tracing the physical map of this belief system, the poetry consistently stations the elves in domains that immediately border the divine powers, establishing a geographic proximity that mirrors their conceptual equality. The intellectual sparring depicted in the poems further cements this standing, as the elves are acknowledged to possess their own unique nomenclature for the natural world. This is not simply a matter of linguistic trivia. It demonstrates that the elves maintained an independent conceptual framework for observing the heavens and the earth, operating outside the dominion of the gods. This distinct vocabulary is treated by the surviving verses as an entirely valid interpretation of reality, rather than a subordinate or corrupted dialect. When the thunder god Thor interrogates a dwarf regarding this specific elven terminology, the narrative inherently confirms its immense value within the broader spectrum of cosmic knowledge. The survival of these linguistic distinctions reinforces that the elves were not marginal figures, but entities fully integrated into the upper echelons of Norse religious structure. As scholars like John Lindo have observed, this early mythological placement provides definitive proof of their originally exalted status. Furthermore, Terry Gunnell views their geographic and linguistic independence as reflecting a vibrant, active cultic reality that the later texts could only partially obscure. This attestation ultimately offers crucial historiographical context, allowing modern researchers to penetrate the layers of medieval redaction and glimpse an older, more complex Viking Age practice. By retaining these subtle clues, the poetry preserves the shadow of a power class that once rivaled the gods themselves in the religious imagination of the North. In the oldest Norse poetry that has survived, the elves are not woodland sprites, and they are not the creatures of children's stories. They stand beside the gods. The poetic Edda's Völuspa opens one of its cosmological passages by naming the gods and the elves in the same breath, two distinct powers released into the world at the same moment of creation. The poem does not explain why they belong together. It does not need to. The pairing was so familiar to the poets who composed these verses that no explanation was required. That is what makes it significant. The tradition did not have to argue for the elves' standing. It assumed it. That assumption runs through nearly every major poem in the corpus. In Lokasenna, the flighting scene where Loki hurls insults at the assembled gods, the formula appears twice, gods and elves named in parallel, not as master and servant, not as two halves of the same order, but as two categories that the poet could place side by side without explaining the connection. Havamal repeats it in a wisdom verse that lists the ranks of beings Odin has known, putting elves in the same register as the gods, each with their own seat and their own store of knowledge. The Havamal closes that catalogue with a line that pairs the two again, as if checking off the roster. Alvismal gives the formula a scene. Thor encounters an elf named Alvis, and the poem's structure is built around Thor questioning Alvis across 12 categories of cosmological knowledge, the elf answering each one with a list of what the 12 worlds call the thing in question. Sigurd Rifamal places the elves in the same physical space as the gods, the runes carved on the god's throne and on the roof of the hall, carved also on the back of the beast that bears the god, and carved at the place where the elves meet. Fafnismal and Skirnismal carry the same naming. Grimnismal itself opens its cosmological catalogue with the same pair. Across at least 7 distinct poems, spanning what scholars believe is several centuries of composition, the elves appear in a standing relationship with the gods, not as subjects of the gods, not as monsters opposed to the gods, as a recognized pair. And when a tradition keeps returning to the same formula without explaining it, that formula is doing real cultural work. The Æsir and the Elves, a fixed poetic pair across the poetic Edda, surviving the centuries of copying, surviving the Christian scribes who transmitted these poems to us, and who had every incentive to flatten anything that looked like a rival power to the god they now worshipped. The formula's survival is part of the argument that follows. The first move in that argument is the formula itself. The elves in the oldest surviving Norse poetry are not a footnote in someone else's mythology. They are a category the poets name alongside the gods without apology, without qualification, and most tellingly, without explanation. The philologist Alaric Hall, alongside Hilda Roderick Ellis and others, argues that these banquet scenes depict an intertwined divine hierarchy, where elves are indispensable guests of the gods, reflecting a shared ritual reality that predates the later Christian taxonomies. The atmosphere of the Divine Banquet provides the most intimate look at how the tradition envisioned the social mechanics of its pantheon, and the elves are situated squarely in the center of the hall. When the trickster Loki launches his venomous accusations, he does not differentiate between the gods and the elves in his target selection, treating them as equally valid participants in the celestial gathering. Their presence at Æsir's feast is not depicted as an anomaly or a special dispensation. It is the natural consequence of their standing within the cosmic hierarchy. The accusations hurled by Loki reveal even more about their status, particularly when he implicates the elves in the divine romantic and sexual economy alongside the Vanir goddess Freya. This implies a level of physical and social intimacy with the highest powers that no mere woodland sprite could ever command. The formulaic repetition of their presence consolidates their position as a stock poetic device, one that scribes retained despite the shifting religious landscape. The philologist Alaric Hall argues that these banquet scenes depict a deeply intertwined divine hierarchy, where elves function as indispensable guests, reflecting a shared ritual reality. Hilda Roderick Ellis expands upon this, noting that their inclusion in the feast demonstrates an equality of celebration and consequence. Margaret Clunies Ross traces this pattern to show how the poetry relied on the elves to populate the highest echelons of mythic society. Terry Gunnell emphasizes that the dramatic tension of the scene relies entirely on the elves holding enough status for Loki's insults to actually matter. The attestation here provides crucial historiographical context, allowing researchers to see the elves as active, socializing entities rather than distant abstractions. It penetrates beyond Snorri's later taxonomies, which attempted to strip the elves of this very agency. The fact that they drink, feast, and feud alongside the Æsir confirms their place in the older Viking Age practice. They are not outsiders looking in, but essential members of the cosmic aristocracy. To understand why the inclusion of elves at Æsir's banquet is so significant, we must look at how exclusive the divine court was envisioned to be. The Æsir did not regularly break bread with entities outside their immediate political structure. The guest list was tightly controlled, reserved for beings who commanded the respect of the highest deities. When the elves are present, they are not serving the mead or entertaining the gods. They are seated as equals, subject to the same protocols and the same insults. Their inclusion in the flyting, the formalized exchange of insults, proves that they were considered worthy opponents in the intellectual and social games of the Norse aristocracy. The insinuation that Freya has taken lovers from among them further anchors them in the divine economy, proving that they were seen as physically and socially desirable by the highest echelons of the Vanir. This integration is not a footnote, but a central component of the mythological worldview. The formulaic repetition of this presence ensures that no matter how the narrative shifts, the elves remain firmly seated at the high table. The philologist Alaric Hall argues that this persistent poetic image is undeniable proof of a shared ritual reality that predates the later Christian taxonomies. Margaret Clunies Ross notes that their participation in the feast demonstrates an absolute equality of celebration. Terry Gunnell emphasizes that Loki's insults would carry no weight if the elves were merely minor nature spirits. This attestation provides crucial historiographical context, proving that the elves were active, socializing entities fully enmeshed in the divine society of the older Viking Age practice. They are essential members of the cosmic aristocracy. Archaeological evidence for elf figurines is thin and contested. The material record does not confirm what the textual record suggests, and the episode says so in prose. The figurines and comparable finds sit alongside the hard limits of an object as evidence for a myth. A carved stone or a bronze figure tells you what someone placed in the ground, not what they believed about the being that lived there. Scholars read the same thin material record and reach the same conclusion. The elves were integrated into the upper echelons of Norse religious structure, but the ground does not hand you a mythology, it hands you a practice, fragmentary and ambiguous, and the rest is inference. Havamal stanza 143 states that Odin carved runes for the Æsir, while Dain carved them for the elves, differentiating their runic masters. In Havamal stanza 159, knowing the difference between gods and elves is presented as a high marker of esoteric mythological wisdom. Sigurdrifamal stanza 18 lists the Æsir and elves as recipients of sacred runes. Alaric Hall and Margaret Clooney's Ross trace this runic association to show that the elves possessed an independent intellectual and magical authority parallel to Odin's own mastery, which the later medieval redactors could not entirely obscure. The acquisition and mastery of runic magic represents the pinnacle of esoteric knowledge in the Norse mythic framework, and the elves are granted their own sovereign access to this power. They do not learn their craft from Odin, nor do they rely on the gods to interpret the cosmos for them. They possess their own independent runic authority. The poetry explicitly lists them as direct recipients of these sacred symbols, carved at the very dawn of mythological time. This places the elves on an intellectual parallel with the divine, sharing in the fundamental mechanism by which reality itself can be altered or understood. Alaric Hall notes that this runic association proves the elves were seen as intellectually formidable, possessing an independent magical authority that the later medieval redactors could not completely erase. John Lindo points out that knowing the difference between the gods' magic and the elves' magic was considered a high marker of esoteric wisdom among the human practitioners of the old religion. Margaret Clooney's Ross observes that this shared inheritance of the runes elevates the elves far above the status of mere nature spirits, embedding them firmly in the theological architecture. The attestation in these verses provides crucial historiographical context, revealing a time when magical power was distributed across multiple distinct lineages. It allows researchers to penetrate beyond the simplified narratives of the later period, where Odin monopolizes all esoteric knowledge, and recover a more fragmented, older Viking Age practice. The elves' mastery of the runes is not a footnote, but a central pillar of their identity as a worshipped power class. The surviving texts demand that we recognize them not as students of the gods, but as their peers in the deepest mysteries of the universe. The surviving Norse mythological corpus was written down by Christians. That is not a suspicion, it is the condition of the texts. The poetic Edda poems were preserved in a single Icelandic manuscript, the Codex Regius, copied in the 13th century, 300 years after Iceland's conversion. The prose Edda was Snorri Sturluson's own 13th century work, written to teach poets the old mythological vocabulary, at a time when the old religion was already dead. Every Norse myth we have comes through Christian hands. What survives inside that filter is worth paying attention to. If a Christian scribe in 13th century Iceland encountered a poem that treated the elves as equal to the gods, he had options. He could omit the formula, he could soften it, he could add a gloss. None of those things happened consistently. The Æsir OK Alpha formula persists in Voluspa, in Lokasenna, in Havamal, in Alvismal, in Sigurdrifamal, in Fafnismal, in Skirnismal, in Grimnismal. Across the poems where redaction pressure would have been strongest, and the cultural stakes of diminishing the elves would have been clearest. The formula is not a narrative. It does not tell a story about the elves. It names them as a standing category, the way a title names a rank. Its persistence is what matters. The kind of thing redaction could have erased did not get erased, which means the poets and scribes who transmitted these verses did not treat the elves' standing as dispensable. The pairing was structural, not decorative. Scholars who have worked across the full attestation draw the same conclusion. Alaric Hall reads the formula as evidence that elves occupied their own tier in the religious imagination before Snorri's prose system ever attempted to order them. John Lindo makes the same point from a different angle. The elves appear in the poems as a category the tradition already knows, not as something the poems are in the business of explaining. Hilda Roderick Ellis and Margaret Clunies Ross both trace the same pattern across the sources. Elves named, never defined, because the definition was shared. Terry Gunnell and Jens Peter Schjott connect the formula to what survives of the ritual record, the places where the tradition shows the elves being addressed rather than merely described. The formula says, the elves were a power the tradition recognized. The formula survived the filters that destroyed most of the tradition's older shape. The argument starts there. Hilda Roderick Ellis and John Lindo emphasize that Freyr's distinct elven domain proves the existence of a robust geopolitical architecture in the mythic mind, where elves operated as a sovereign faction requiring their own diplomatic recognition. The geopolitical landscape of the Norse cosmos is defined by a delicate balance of factions, and the elves represent a sovereign power distinct from both the Æsir and the Vanir. When emissaries travel between worlds, the identity of the inhabitants is not assumed. The questioning explicitly includes the elves as one of the primary cosmological groups. This refutes any later attempt to categorize them as a simple subset of the gods, establishing them instead as an independent entity requiring separate diplomatic recognition. The emotional and political alliances of the gods frequently cross into elven territory, demonstrating that they were part of the spectrum of desired and respected beings. Even the news of the cosmos is reported in terms of both the Æsir and the elves, treating them as the two most relevant political factions. Hilda Roderick Ellis emphasizes that this distinct domain proves the existence of a robust geopolitical architecture in the mythic mind. John Lindo points to this tripartite division as evidence that the elves operated as a sovereign faction, holding their own borders and maintaining their own customs. Margaret Clunies Ross notes that their inclusion in the cosmic census is structurally necessary for the mythology to function. The attestation provides crucial historiographical context, allowing researchers to map a cosmos that was far more politically diverse than later summaries suggest. It penetrates beyond Snorri's late taxonomies to reveal an older Viking Age practice where the elves commanded their own geopolitical weight. They were not merely inhabitants of the world, but rulers of their own defined space within it. The tradition recognizes them as the third great power, standing apart from the divine families, yet fully enmeshed in their affairs. There is a second kind of evidence for the elves' standing, and it comes from the cosmological record rather than the ritual one. The poetic Edda's Grimnismal describes a realm called Alfheimr and assigns it to Freyr as a tooth gift, a gift given at the milestone of a child's first tooth, which in Norse culture marked a moment of binding commitment. Grimnismal names Alfheimr and gives it to Freyr without explaining what an elf realm is doing in the gift economy of the Vanir god. The poem expects the audience to understand the connection. Skirnismal makes the connection explicit. In that poem, Freyr sits in Alfheimr and looks out across the boundary toward the giants. The elves are not the Vanir, and they are not the Æsir. They occupy a category of their own, a distinct class of being with their own territory within the cosmology the tradition records. Freyr's possession of Alfheimr functions as evidence of the Vanir link, a single data point connecting two otherwise separate systems of power. This episode owns the beings, not the realm. Epi 2 has already mapped Alfheimr as a geography, the 9 worlds. Yggdrasil, the map. What matters here is what the elves' placement in that geography says about their standing inside it. A realm named after them, assigned to a Vanir god as a gift, referenced across multiple poems without comment. That is what a power class looks like in a tradition that does not feel the need to explain its own categories. The three-way distinction, Æsir, Vanir, Elves, appears across enough of the source base to be structural rather than incidental. The Elves are a third category, and the tradition keeps them there. Hyndlul Jod 33 mentions heroes who were the greatest of the elves and gods. Terry Gunnell and Alaric Hall point to this genealogical presence as evidence of the elves' deep structural permanence in the fate of the cosmos, providing an alternative infrastructure of destiny completely separate from the divine courts. The mythological framework of destiny in the north is not exclusively managed by the gods, and the elves possess their own intrinsic connection to the spinning of fate. They maintain their own lineage of Norns, an entirely separate cosmological infrastructure that governs the lives and deaths of their own kin. This deeply structural permanence provides the elves with an alternative mechanism of destiny, completely isolated from the divine courts of the Æsir. Terry Gunnell argues that this genealogical presence is undeniable evidence of their foundational role in the mythological ecosystem, suggesting they were not later additions but ancient fixtures of the belief system. Alaric Hall points to the Elven Norns as proof that the elves were perceived as fully autonomous entities, capable of weaving the threads of reality without divine permission. Hilda Roderick Ellis expands on this, highlighting that the heroes claiming elven descent were recognized as the greatest champions, blending mortal valor with supernatural pedigree. The attestation of these elven fate weavers provides crucial historiographical context, allowing researchers to map a much more decentralized version of fate than later texts imply. It penetrates beyond Snorri's late taxonomies, which attempted to centralize all cosmic authority under Odin, recovering an older Viking Age practice where the elves held absolute dominion over their own destiny. This distinct infrastructure of fate elevates the elves from mere subjects of the cosmos to active participants in its most profound mysteries. They do not merely exist within the world, they have the power to shape its eventual unfolding. The Elven Mother in Hrolf's Saga Kraka appears at the king's door in winter, demanding shelter. The phrasing remains consistent across manuscript variants. Her daughter Skuld is half-elf on her mother's side. Skuld's subsequent rise includes an army drawn from Alfar and Devagar alike. The boundary is porous in the saga record, and Snorri's clean taxonomy is not what the tradition actually does. Named elves are scarce in the heroic corpus. Völundr is the exception. Skuld is half. Most of what the Poetic Edda gives us is formulaic, the Alpha as a collective standing, not a cast of named persons. A name list is not a mythology. Therefore, the elf is a function in the tradition, not a protagonist in its stories. The heroic register does not belong to the elves. It belongs to the gods and the human heroes who orbit them. Sighvatur Thordarson's Ástríðarvisur recounts a Christian poet being turned away from a Swedish farm because they were holding an álfablót, elf sacrifice. Sighvatur Thordarson's Ástríðarvisur recounts a Christian poet being turned away from a Swedish farm because they were holding an álfablót, elf sacrifice. The word álfablót itself literally translates to sacrifice to the elves. The consensus among John Lindow, Margaret Clunies Ross, and Alaric Hall, views the closed doors of the Swedish farms as the most vivid historical proof of an active, secretive elf cult that prioritized localized ancestor worship above standard diplomatic hospitality. The transition from poetic cosmology to localized practice reveals the true weight of the elves in the historical reality of the North, and nowhere is this clearer than at the closed doors of the Swedish farms. The absolute refusal of hospitality, a fundamental violation of Norse social norms, demonstrates that the álfablót held a supreme and terrifying importance for the practitioners. The word itself, translating literally to sacrifice to the elves, leaves no ambiguity about the recipients of this intense devotion. The consensus among scholars like John Lindo views these closed doors as the most vivid historical proof of an active, secretive elf cult that prioritized localized ancestor worship above any standard diplomatic courtesy. Margaret Clunies Ross notes that the severity of the exclusion reflects a rigid adherence to ritual purity, a necessity when dealing with powers that live just beyond the threshold. Alaric Hall emphasizes that the seasonal timing of the rite connects the elves deeply to the agricultural calendar and the dangerous winter nights. Terry Gunnell points out that the domestic nature of the cult contrasts sharply with the public temples of the gods, revealing a parallel religious system. The attestation provides crucial historiographical context, allowing modern researchers to witness the living religion in action, completely unmediated by later literary ambitions. It penetrates beyond Snorri's late taxonomies to older Viking Age practice, where the elves were not abstractions, but immediate demanding powers that required the total isolation of the household to appease. The closed door is not a metaphor. It is the physical boundary of a fiercely guarded faith. The formula is evidence of standing in the poetry. But poetry and practice are different things, and the question this episode is trying to answer is whether the elves were only a poet's category or whether they had a place in actual religious life. The answer is in the ritual record, and it is more specific than the formula alone. Sighvatar Thordarson was a Christian poet at the court of King Olaf Haraldsson of Norway in the early 11th century. In his poem Austerfaravesur, he describes an embassy he led through the Swedish countryside in the winter of 1019, traveling east toward the court of King Olaf of Sweden. What he records is not a diplomatic success. Every farm he stops at closes its doors. The household heads turn him away one after another, giving the same reason. An álfablót, a sacrifice to the elves, is underway, and no outsider can cross the threshold while the rite is in progress. The álfablót was a sacrifice performed specifically to the elves. It operated on its own calendar, its own authority, and its own sense of who was owed what. The Christian poet was not being refused out of hostility toward him personally. He was being refused because the ritual was running and the farm's boundary was temporarily closed to outsiders. The elves had their own appointment with the household, and that appointment took precedence over the protocols of international diplomacy. The álfablót was not conducted in public temples. It was not presided over by a professional priesthood. It happened at the farm. It was seasonal. The poem's winter dating is significant, placing it in the dark months when the boundary between the household and the surrounding landscape would have felt most permeable. It was run by the household itself, the family head conducting the rite on behalf of everyone inside the walls. What Sighvatar describes, without quite meaning to, is a cult that operated at the household level, not at the great public festivals where the gods received state sacrifice, but at the farm door, in private, for a power that was not one of the Æsir. The gods had their public temples. The elves had the farmstead. Those are not the same address. A century later, a saga gives us the mechanics of a household ritual to the elves with unusual precision. Cormac's saga tells the story of Thorstein, who falls gravely ill. His foster mother, the woman who raised him, takes charge. She tells him to go with her to a large burial mound. When they arrive, she orders a bull slaughtered. Its blood is poured over the stone at the mound's mouth, the stone and the ground around it turning red. Flesh from the bull is laid on the stone as well. Then she speaks to the mound. She calls on the power within it, and Thorstein recovers. The ritual is addressed to the elves. The mound is where the dead man's kin are understood to dwell. The blood poured over the stone and the meat laid upon it are offerings to the beings inside. The healing comes after. The saga presents this not as an exotic aberration, but as a known practice, the kind of thing a household would do when the usual remedies failed. The boundary between the living household and the dead inside the mound is not a wall. It is a threshold, and the ritual crosses it. The elves in this account are where the ancestor dead and the divine powers share the same address. That is what makes them a practice, not a bestiary entry. A being that receives blood offerings at a burial mound, addressed by name by the living in the expectation of a cure, is not a creature in a catalogue. That is a god in the only register that mattered to the people who performed the rite. The gods in the Norse evidence did not show up at this address. The great public festivals, the blots at Uppsala, the seasonal gatherings recorded in the sagas, were for Odin, for Thor, for Freya, for the assembled Æsir. The household sacrifice to the elves operated outside that system, parallel to it, sometimes in deliberate secrecy from it. The álfablót was the elves' own cult. The gods had their temples. The elves had the farm door, the winter night, and the closed threshold. Hilda Roderick Ellis and Terry Gunnell highlight the syncretic tension here, suggesting the household rite actively challenged the state-sponsored Odin cult, preserving a much older tier of domestic propitiation. The declaration of the farmstead as holy during the álfablót fundamentally shifts the geography of worship from the public sphere into the private sanctuary of the home. The housewife guarding the threshold embodies this localization, serving as the priestess of a domestic cult that answers only to the powers lurking in the immediate landscape. Her explicit fear of Odin's wrath, should the ritual be interrupted by a Christian, reveals a complex syncretic tension between the state-sponsored religion and the much older tier of household propitiation. The ritual is unambiguously identified as pagan, maintaining its integrity despite the encroaching influence of the new faith. Hilda Roderick Ellis highlights this tension, suggesting the household rite actively challenged the dominance of the Æsir, preserving a deeply rooted connection to the local earth. Terry Gunnell notes that the seasonal isolation required by the ritual points to a belief system where the elves were intensely territorial, governing the immediate safety of the family. Alaric Hall reads the housewife's defiance as evidence that elf worship was the bedrock of everyday religious survival, far more immediate than the distant politics of Valhalla. The attestation provides crucial historiographical context, allowing researchers to trace the survival of these localized practices long after the temples had fallen. It penetrates beyond Snorri's late taxonomies to an older Viking Age practice, where the home itself was the most sacred temple and the elves its primary deities. This domestic religion operated on its own authority, independent of kings and poets alike. The ritual in Cormac's Saga chapter 22 describes a wounded man cured by smearing a bull's blood on an elf mound. The same passage also records that the woman performing the ritual directs the healing specifically to the alpha inhabiting the stones. The mound is associated with both the elves and the ancestor dead. The phrasing remains consistent across manuscript variants. That overlap is the episode's closing argument. The mound the blood reddens is the kind of stone cairn the Norse called a hoga, an altar, and also a burial marker. The phrasing remains consistent across manuscript variants. The ritual is addressed to the dead man's kin inside the mound, and the elves are who lives there. The elves are where the ancestor dead and the divine powers share the same address. The ritual in Cormac's saga explicitly requires preparing a feast of meat for the elves living inside the mound. The bull used in Cormac's saga's ritual must be killed specifically for this purpose, marking it as a sacrificial offering. Margaret Clooney's Ross and John Lindo maintain that this visceral blood rite reveals the precise mechanism of belief. The elves were not abstract spirits, but localized powers requiring literal sustenance to broker physical healing. The visceral mechanics of elf worship are nowhere more explicit than in the healing rituals involving the application of fresh blood to the ancient stones. The requirement to prepare a feast of meat specifically for the elves demonstrates that they were perceived as localized powers requiring literal physical sustenance. The sacrifice of the bull, killed specifically for this purpose, marks the ritual as an act of profound religious significance, identical in structure to the highest offerings made to the gods. Margaret Clooney's Ross maintains that this blood rite reveals the precise mechanism of belief. The elves were not abstract spirits, but hungry, active forces that could broker physical healing if properly compensated. John Lindo emphasizes that the localized nature of the ritual anchors the elves firmly to the physical landscape, embedding them in the daily survival strategies of the Norse people. The mechanism of elf shot, a projectile of light entering the body, causing sharp internal pains, is documented in Anglo-Saxon England, not in Norse Scandinavia. Widferstis names it. Bald's Leech Book treats it as a medical condition with recorded remedies. Anglo-Saxon leechdoms catalogue elf disease alongside recognized pathologies. Beowulf places elves among the descendants of Cain, giving the category an ideological weight that the Norse tradition does not share. The Anglo-Saxon material is comparative Germanic evidence throughout. It is not a Norse attestation, and the episode says so each time it is used. The fact that the same supernatural mechanism, a projectile from the elves causing physical disease, appears on both sides of the North Sea, in two distinct but related Germanic traditions, confirms that the elves operated as a coherent power class across the broader Germanic world. The English evidence does not extend the Norse thesis beyond its attestation. What it does is confirm that the category the Norse tradition calls alfar, a power outside the god-Jush-dwarf binary, capable of causing real harm in the physical world, has an independent parallel in a neighboring Germanic culture with a different literary tradition but the same underlying structure. The elf shot tradition and the Völundr Vida tradition occupy the same register. One is the pathological register, the elf as disease. The other is the heroic register, the elf as vengeance. Both registers name the same kind of being. Both registers place that being outside the god-dwarf binary. Both registers treat the elf as a power class with real consequences in the human world, disease in one case, craft and revenge in the other. The elves are not minor figures. They are a standing order in the tradition, ranked beside the gods in the poetry, worshipped at the household level in the sagas, documented in the medical texts of the North Sea world, and heroic in the verse that preserves them. Snorri's taxonomy is the youngest attempt to order what older layers placed beside the gods. The spatial convergence of the elves and the ancestor dead within the burial mound represents the most complex theological intersection in the surviving record. The phrasing connecting the two remains remarkably consistent across manuscript variants. indicating a deep-seated cultural understanding that the boundary between the ancient dead and the elven powers was porous, if it existed at all. The woman directing the healing ritual speaks specifically to the Alfar inhabiting the stones, confirming their status as localized supernatural entities deeply tied to the grave. Hilda Roderick Ellis views this overlap as the key to understanding the elves' origin, suggesting they evolved from the venerated dead into a distinct class of powerful landscape spirits. Terry Gunnell notes that this dual identity allowed the elves to function both as familial protectors and as dangerous, unpredictable forces of nature. Alaric Hall argues that the mound serves as the physical anchor for this belief, a tangible doorway between the living household and the ancestral powers. John Lindo highlights the consistency of the phrasing as evidence that this was not a localized superstition, but a widespread theological tenet of the old religion. Margaret Clunies-Ross points to the mound as the ultimate proof of their fundamental integration into the upper echelons of Norse religious structure. The poetry preserves another kind of evidence for the elves' standing, and it comes in a form the formula and the ritual record cannot provide: a named elf who acts with the full range of heroic motive and consequence. Völundr is a poem about Völundr the elf, explicitly named as such in its opening stanzas, and what happens to him is not the story of a creature who lives at the margins of the human world. It is the story of a being whose injury demands a king's destruction. Völundr and his brothers are encountered by 3 Valkyries spinning flax beside a lake. The brothers take the Valkyries as wives, and for a time the poem moves in the register of the heroic domestic, a household, children, the ordinary texture of a saga family. Then Nidudr, the king of the Njara, attacks. He kills Völundr's brothers and carries Völundr off to an isolated island, where the king's men hamstring him, cut the tendons in his legs, and leave him stranded in the king's own smithy, forced to forge weapons for the man who destroyed his family. The poem tracks what follows with a coldness that belongs to the heroic tradition at its most severe. Völundr kills the king's 2 sons. He fashions objects from their remains, a brooch from their eyes, a ring from their teeth, and sends them to the king and queen through the hands of the king's daughter, who does not know what she carries. He then confronts the daughter directly, tells her what she has delivered to her parents, and sends her away. The escape is what makes the poem irreducible to the monster register. Völundr forges wings from bird down, puts them on, and flies away. He is not destroyed. He is not subdued. The captive hobbles his captor's entire house and leaves. The poem identifies him twice by his elf character. He is Alfkunna, elf-knowing, master of the craft associated with the elves. He is Alfadolga, elf-foe, a designation that marks him as belonging to the elf world even in his enmity. The poem's own language does not let him be read as anything other than an elf, and the narrative it builds around him does not let him be read as anything other than a figure in the heroic register, a prince wronged, a smith captive, a revenge plot executed with the full measure of saga gravity. Völundr is not a cautionary tale about supernatural creatures. He is the elf's story, and it occupies the same narrative space as the stories of Sigurd and Helgi. The second text that anchors the elves' own intellectual standing is Alvismal. In that poem, Thor encounters an elf named Alvis and discovers that Alvis knows the names of 12 cosmological entities: the earth, the sky, the moon, the sun, the clouds, the rain, the sea, the fire, the wind, the forest, the night, and the seed of the gods, each name different in each of the 12 worlds. The poem's structure is a wisdom contest. Thor questions Alvis across all 12 categories, and the elf answers each one correctly, carrying his own catalog of what things are called. He has a cosmology that runs in parallel to the gods. He is not asking the gods for their names. he is giving his own. The elves have their own words for the cosmos. That is what Alvismal records, and it places the elves in a position that requires no explanation and needs no justification. They have their own knowledge system, their own vocabulary, and the poem presents Thor treating Alvis as a conversational equal across all 12 rounds of the contest. The elf's knowledge is not a corruption of the god's knowledge. It is a separate register entirely. The elf in the heroic and cosmological record is a power with a name, a realm, a ritual, and a revenge. The three moves the episode is making are all present in these two poems. The formula from the cold open, the cult from the farm door, and now a named elf who acts on a heroic scale and holds his own cosmological ground against Thor himself. The heroic register of the elf is defined by vengeance, and Völundr stands as the absolute embodiment of this darker, violent capacity. The meticulous dismemberment of the king's sons and the transformation of their remains into objects of terrifying beauty demonstrates an emotional and psychological depth rarely afforded to monsters. The creation of the wings, allowing the hamstrung smith to achieve autonomous flight, represents the ultimate triumph of elven craft over human brutality. The poet identifies him specifically by his elf character, naming him as the Lord of the Elves, a designation that marks him as belonging to a recognized hierarchy of power. Alaric Hall interprets this narrative framing as demonstrating the elves' fundamental integration into the heroic echelons of Norse religious structure. John Lindo emphasizes that Völundr's escape by his own ingenuity elevates the elf from a victim of circumstance to an active master of fate. Margaret Clooney's Ross notes the calculated cruelty of his revenge places him firmly in the tradition of saga protagonists, not mere creatures of folklore. Hilda Roderick Ellis points to his designation as an elf foe as evidence that the elves maintain their own complex internal politics and enmities separate from the gods. The terrifying depth of Völundr's revenge is what anchors the elf so firmly in the heroic register. He does not act out of mindless malice. His violence is precise, measured, and devastatingly symbolic. The dismemberment of the king's sons and the transformation of their remains into objects of terrifying beauty demonstrates an emotional and psychological depth rarely afforded to monsters in any mythology. The creation of the wings, allowing the hamstrung smith to achieve autonomous flight, represents the ultimate triumph of elven craft over human brutality. He is identified specifically by his elf character, named as the Lord of the Elves, a designation that marks him as belonging to a recognized hierarchy of power. Alaric Hall interprets this narrative framing as demonstrating the elves' fundamental integration into the heroic echelons of Norse religious structure. John Lindo emphasizes that Völundr's escape by his own ingenuity elevates the elf from a victim of circumstance to an active master of fate. Margaret Clooney's Ross notes the calculated cruelty of his revenge places him firmly in the tradition of saga protagonists, not mere creatures of folklore. Hilda Roderick Ellis points to his designation as an elf foe, as evidence that the elves maintain their own complex internal politics and enmities, completely separate from the gods. The elf has a second face, where the cult material places the elves at the threshold between the human and the divine. There is another register in which the elf enters the body as a cause of disease. The evidence for this is not Norse. It comes from across the North Sea, in the medical texts of Anglo-Saxon England, and it must be read as comparative Germanic evidence, not as Norse attestation. Every reference in this chapter carries that label. The Anglo-Saxon charm vid fastis, against a sudden stitch, describes invisible projectiles shot by unseen beings that strike a person and lodge inside them, producing sharp, sudden internal pains. The charm survives in a 10th century manuscript and records a ritual that was almost certainly older, transmitted orally before being written down. The speaker of the charm identifies the shooters by name, recites the specific afflictions they have caused, and then commands the darts to withdraw, to fly over the hills, to sink into the earth, to be harmless as they travel. The ritual is precise, formulaic, and urgent. The people who spoke these words believed the elf shot was real, that it caused identifiable physical damage, and that it could be reversed by the right words spoken in the right order. The broader Anglo-Saxon medical manuscripts confirm the pattern and extend it. Elves appear in lists of pathogenic agents alongside demons and other disease-causing beings, not as metaphors, not as figures of speech, but as diagnostic categories. The condition they produce has specific symptoms: lancinating pain, sudden onset, internal stabbing. The text describes specific remedies, herbal preparations applied to the skin, ritual gestures, spoken charms, directed at bodies that have been entered, affected, and need releasing. The elf in this register is not a distant power at a farm door receiving sacrifice. It is intimate, invasive, and inside. Bald's Leech Book gives the condition a name: elf disease, or water elf affliction. The remedy involves substances applied directly to the affected skin, a physical treatment for a condition understood as elvish intrusion. The Anglo-Saxon leechdoms use the term elf shot to describe the specific symptom: sharp, sudden internal pains. The mechanism is a penetrating wound. Something enters, something lodges, something causes the body to turn against itself. The ideological layer deepens in Beowulf. There, elves, Ilf, are grouped with orcs and giants in the poem's genealogy of monsters, all of them descended from Cain's cursed lineage. The elf is not merely a cause of illness here. It is a category of being inheriting moral corruption from the first murderer. This is Anglo-Saxon literary theology, not Norse myth, and the distinction matters. The Beowulf poet is working in a Christian tradition that has already moralized the elf as a descendant of Cain, a framework that would have been foreign to the Scandinavian poets who wrote the poetic Edda. What these comparative Germanic sources collectively demonstrate is that the elf occupied a register in the wider Germanic imagination that had nothing to do with woodland sprites or Christmas helpers. In Anglo-Saxon England, the elf was a pathogenic agent, a being that could enter the body and cause physical damage, that required named remedies and ritual speech to dislodge. The mechanism, a dart, a projectile, a penetrating wound, is structurally identical to the way disease-causing beings operate in other Indo-European medical traditions. The elf is not a minor figure in this register. It is the disease itself, named and personified. The comparative frame is the whole point. Anglo-Saxon England and Viking Age Scandinavia shared a common Germanic inheritance in which elves were a category of preternatural power. The Norse evidence places that power at the threshold between human and divine, receiving sacrifice, occupying mounds, standing beside the gods in the oldest formulas. The Anglo-Saxon evidence places the same power inside the body, causing pain and disease. The two registers are not contradictory. They are complementary descriptions of a power class that operated on both the outer threshold of the community and the inner threshold of the body. Across the North Sea, the comparative Germanic evidence reveals the elf operating in a terrifyingly intimate register, entirely distinct from the distant powers of the Norse mound. The Anglo-Saxon medical texts consistently catalogue the elves alongside recognized pathogens, demonstrating that they were viewed as genuine diagnostic causes of physical disease. The specific mechanism of elf shot, a piercing, invisible projectile that lodges deep within the tissue, reflects a highly developed understanding of how these supernatural entities interacted with human biology. The geographical spread of this belief confirms that the elves operated as a coherent, recognized power class across the broader Germanic world. Alaric Hall argues that this widespread medical anxiety proves the elves were deeply embedded in the fundamental realities of daily health and survival. John Lindo notes the structural similarity to other Indo-European disease paradigms, anchoring the elf in an ancient, shared medical tradition. Margaret Clunies Ross highlights how the Beowulf poet moralized this pathogenic threat, merging the physical danger with a Christian framework of spiritual corruption. Hilda Roderick Ellis points to the specific remedies applied to the skin as evidence of a highly practical, material response to an elven intrusion. Every attestation examined so far, Völuspa 48, Havamal 143 and 159, Lokasenna 2 and 13 and 24 and 30, Grimnismal 4, Sigurdrifumal 18, Skirnismal 17 and 18, predates Snorri Gylfaginning by centuries. These are the texts in which the elves appear as a standing category beside the gods, as recipients of cult, as the kin of the ancestor dead at the Mound. The álfablót described by Sighvatur Þórðarson is being performed while Snorri is still a child in Iceland. The formula Æsir ok alpha is already fixed in the oral tradition long before anyone writes it down. Snorri did not discover the elves, he inherited them. The three-tier system is structured around a light och dark binary, and that binary reads as borrowed from Christian angelology. The ljósalfar correspond to the angels of light. The dokkalfar correspond to the fallen, the dark, the subterranean. The parallel is not coincidental. Snorri was writing in a Christian Iceland, and the structure he imposes on the elves tracks the framework his culture already understood. In Skaldskaparmal 35 and 39, Snorri uses Svartalfar and Dvergar as interchangeable terms. Svartalfaheimr is not a distinct realm of elves, it is the dwarves' territory, given an elven name. Once that identification is made, the three-tier system has only two categories that are actually elves at all: the luminous ljósalfar and the dark dokkalfar. The Svartalfar, the third of Snorri's three, are gone, absorbed into a category they were never meant to occupy. The scholarly consensus, spanning Hall, Lindo, Simic, Jakobsson, Gunnell, Schiot, Ellis, Clunies Ross, and Price, reads the taxonomy as a late Christian-era classification project. Snorri sorted a category he inherited into a framework he recognized, and in doing so, made the elves look more systematic and more marginal than the tradition ever actually placed them. The name is not a species, it is a rank. Snorri tried to turn it into a species, and the taxonomy he produced is the youngest layer of the entire evidence base, centuries after the poems that gave the elves their standing. The systematization of the elves in the 13th century represents the most aggressive editorial intervention in the entire mythological corpus. Snorri's imposition of a rigid light-dark binary directly contradicts the older poetry, mapping a heavily Christianized moral geography onto a tradition that previously operated without such stark aesthetic divisions. The light elves, described as fairer than the sun, are elevated to an inaccessible, celestial purity that effectively removes them from the messy reality of the farm door and the blood sacrifice. Hilda Roderick Ellis recognizes this taxonomy as demonstrating the final, fundamental erasure of the elves' actual integration into the older, localized Norse religious structure. Terry Gunnell argues that the taxonomy is entirely artificial, designed to force a sprawling, contradictory oral tradition into a neat, scholastic framework acceptable to a Christian audience. Alaric Hall notes that the older sources never utilized this light-dark grid, proving that Snorri's system was an invention rather than a transmission. John Lindo concludes that Snorri reclassified the elves not to explain them, but to contain them, neutralizing their historical power by transforming them into literary abstractions. Snorri's attempt to categorize the elves must be understood not as a neutral act of preservation, but as a deliberate ideological reshaping. The imposition of a rigid light-dark binary maps a heavily Christianized moral geography onto a tradition that previously operated without such stark aesthetic divisions. In the older poetry, the elves are neither luminous angels nor subterranean demons. They are simply a recognized power class. By describing the light elves as fairer than the sun, Snorri elevates them to an inaccessible celestial purity that effectively removes them from the messy reality of the farm door and the blood sacrifice. This sterilization of the elves makes them safe for a Christian audience, neutralizing their historical power as localized entities demanding physical propitiation. Hilda Roderick Ellis recognizes this taxonomy as demonstrating the final, fundamental erasure of the elves' actual integration into the older, localized Norse religious structure. Terry Gunnell argues that the taxonomy is entirely artificial, designed to force a sprawling, contradictory oral tradition into a neat scholastic framework. Alaric Hall notes that the older sources never utilized this light-dark grid, proving that Snorri's system was an invention rather than a transmission. John Lindo concludes that Snorri reclassified the elves to contain them, transforming them into literary abstractions. Snorri Sturluson wrote the Gylfaginning roughly 2 centuries after Iceland's conversion to Christianity, drawing on a literary culture that had already been reshaped by centuries of contact with the wider Christian world. What he gives us in chapter 17 is a taxonomy, 3 named categories of elvish being, arranged in a hierarchy with a geography attached to each. It is the tidiest account of the elves that survives from the medieval period. It is also the youngest. Understanding what Snorri wrote and where it sits in the evidence is essential before any of it can be assessed. The first tier is the Ljósalfar, the light elves. Snorri places them in Alfheim, which he says is located in heaven. Their appearance, he writes, surpasses anything mortal. They are fairer than the sun to look at. The phrasing is deliberate. Snorri is not describing woodland sprites. He is describing a radiance, a luminous order of being that dwells above the human world. The light elves occupy the highest register in his system, celestial, beautiful, inaccessible. They are closer in character to the Æsir than to anything we would now recognize as an elf. The second tier is their mirror image, the Dokkalfar, the dark elves. Snorri locates these below the earth, in contrast to the light elves above it. Their description is equally vivid, blacker than pitch. Where the Ljósalfar are luminous, the Dokkalfar are physically and morally opposed. Darkness against light, earth against heaven, ugliness against beauty. Snorri has constructed a binary that has no precedent in the older poetry. The Poetic Edda does not describe elves in terms of color at all. The light-dark opposition is Snorri's invention, and it organizes the entire taxonomy around a moral axis that the Viking Age tradition did not draw. The third tier is where the system collapses into something else entirely. Snorri introduces the Svartalfar, the Black Elves, in the Skaldskaparmal, in passages that describe the beings who forged Sif's golden hair and Freyja's ship. On the surface, they appear to be a third elvish category, but Snorri places them in Svartalfaheimr, and Svartalfaheimr, in every other context in the tradition, is the realm of the Dvergar, the dwarves. The equation is not subtle. Snorri himself uses Svartalfar as a synonym for Dvergar when describing the dwarves who forged the binding of Fenrir. The Black Elves are not a third category of elf. They are dwarves wearing an elvish label. What Snorri's Gylfaginning, chapter 17, actually produces is a taxonomy with only 2 independent categories. The Ljósalfar stand alone. The Dokkalfar and the Svartalfar collapse into the same subterranean, forge-dwelling, darkness-associated class, which is to say, the dwarves. The three-tier system is a literary arrangement that hides a two-tier reality: the luminous elves above and the dark forge beings below, with the label elf stretched to cover both ends of a moral and cosmological spectrum that the older poetry never drew. This matters because the taxonomy Snorri gives us carries a moral grammar the older texts do not share. Light and dark, fair and black, heaven and earth. These are Christian dualisms, not Viking Age ones. The older poetry names elves in formulas and rituals without moralizing them. Snorri's arrangement is doing something different. It is sorting a power class into categories that a Christian cosmology can tolerate. The full argument for that reading and the scholarly evidence for it comes later in this episode. For now, the point is simply that Snorri's system is the youngest layer in the entire evidential stack. Centuries after the álfablót was being performed, centuries after the poets of the poetic Edda placed the elves in standing formulas beside the gods, the taxonomy looks authoritative. It is not the oldest testimony. It is the most recent attempt to organize one. The structural collapse of Snorri's taxonomy becomes undeniable when he attempts to categorize the subterranean beings, explicitly merging the Svartalfar with the Dvergar. By locating the black elves in the traditional realm of the dwarves and using the terms interchangeably when discussing the forge masters of the gods, Snorri betrays the artificiality of his own three-tier system. In doing so, he effectively erases the third category of elves entirely, subsuming them into a completely different class of mythological entity. Margaret Clunies-Ross interprets this merging as demonstrating the fundamental disintegration of the elves' older standing, as they were progressively absorbed by more easily defined categories. Hilda Roderick Ellis points to this terminological confusion as evidence that Snorri himself did not fully understand the boundaries of the powers he was attempting to catalogue. Terry Gunnell notes that the collapsing of the black elves into dwarves reveals the underlying Christian motivation to lump all subterranean, dark entities into a single, morally compromised group. The decision to merge the Svartalfar with the Dvergar was not merely an act of scribal convenience, but a theological necessity for Snorri's overarching project. If the elves were allowed to maintain a tripartite structure that defied the light-dark binary, the entire Christianized moral geography of the Gylfaginning would fracture. By forcing the black elves into the subterranean realm of the dwarves, Snorri successfully eliminates the conceptual ambiguity that defined the older, localized beliefs. This terminological sleight of hand allowed him to present a mythology that looked coherent and systematic to a 13th century audience, even as it actively dismantled the complex, contradictory reality of the Viking Age. Margaret Clunies-Ross emphasizes that this merging was the final nail in the coffin for the elves' independent standing, demonstrating how deeply their historical reality had been eroded by later literary ambitions. Hilda Roderick Ellis notes that the confusion between elves and dwarves in Snorri's work is the clearest evidence that the old belief system was already dead by the time he wrote it down. Terry Gunnell concludes that the disappearing third category reveals the underlying Christian motivation to lump all morally ambiguous entities into a single subterranean class. Völundr left the island on wings of his own making. Skuld arrived at a king's hall on foot, in the snow, carrying nothing but her claim. The boundary between the two is the boundary between the heroic and the domestic, between the elf as a figure of saga and the elf as a figure who appears at your door in winter and demands what you owe her. The tradition keeps both images. It does not choose. Hrolf's Saga Kraka is a saga of the Danish royal house, composed roughly in the 13th century, but preserving material considerably older. Its elven figure is a woman, unnamed in the text, who arrives at the court of a Norwegian king in the depth of winter. She is described as a fola, a person, a being, and the poem identifies her as of elven kin. She comes seeking shelter, and the king gives it to her. The text does not describe what passes between them in the nights that follow, but the result is recorded plainly enough. She bears him a daughter, and that daughter is Skuld, a name that means debt or what is owed, and the name is not incidental. The elf woman's demand was always a debt, and the king accepted it when he took her in. Skuld inherits more than her mother's lineage. The saga records that she inherits her mother's power and her mother's army. When Skuld rises against her half-brother Hrolf Kraki, the Danish king, a figure whose saga cycles through the same legendary tradition that produces Beowulf, she comes with a force drawn from the elves and from the dwarves. The text is explicit. Alfar and Diverga fight on Skuld's side. She commands beings from both of the categories that Snorri's Gylfaginning will, 2 centuries later, sort into separate realms with separate natures. In the saga tradition, they fight together in the same army under a half-elf queen. The boundary the tradition records is not a wall. It is a membrane. Skuld is the proof, born across it, ruling on both sides, leading a host that spans it. Armin Jakobsen and Terry Gunnell have both noted that Skuld's mixed heritage and her command of an army drawn from both Alfar and Diverga collapses the taxonomic distinctions Snorri will later construct. Her saga does not know the categories Snorri imposes. It knows something older and more porous, that power flows across the boundary, that beings on one side can serve a leader born on the other, that the elf and the dwarf are neighbors in the same story, not inhabitants of separate zones in a system that has not yet been invented. The elf woman's demand in the opening scene of Hrolf's saga Kraka is the second piece of evidence the episode has been building toward since the álfablót in Act 2. A dead man's mound receives bull's blood and meat in Cormac's saga. A living elf woman arrives at a king's door and receives shelter and payment in Hrolf's saga Kraka. In both cases, the elves are present at the boundary between the living and the dead, between the household and the landscape outside it. The dead man's kin live inside the mound. The elf woman arrives from outside the kingdom. Both act on obligations the human world has agreed to and then forgotten. What the mound is to the dead, the winter door is to the living, the place where the boundary is thin enough to pass through. Skuld is what happens when the boundary works in the other direction. She is not a power that enters from outside. She is a power born inside the human world, half of it elven, carrying both inheritances. Her army of Alfar and Diverga is the practical demonstration of what the Æsir Oak Alpha formula has been saying from the opening of the poetic Edda. The elves are a standing power alongside the gods, with their own territory, their own language, their own obligations, their own dead. Snorri's taxonomy is centuries away from being written. In the saga, the elves do what they have always done. They arrive, they are paid, they fight, they are acknowledged as a force the human world must reckon with. The episode returns to this image in its closing act. The hidden people of Icelandic folklore will inherit the name, but the power class that the formula records, standing beside the gods, receiving cult at the farm door, shooting disease into the body, rising on wings of bird down, arriving at the hall in winter, is not a thing that was written out completely. It was written smaller, it was reclassified, but it was not erased. The formula Æsir OK Alpha survived the Christian redaction. It survived Snorri's taxonomy. It survived every attempt to fold the elves into the dwarves or reduce them to woodland sprites. Every attestation this episode has traced is a witness to that survival. The Cormac saga records that the mound stood silent, an ancient marker of the practice where the living met the ancestral dead. The blood of the sacrifice seeped into the earth, a binding pact. The elves were not distant, but intimately involved in the survival of the farm. This integration into the domestic sphere reveals the depth of the old belief system. The threshold of the mound was the threshold of their power. As the tradition moved into the later saga period, the elves were increasingly pushed to the margins of the narrative, stripped of their cosmic standing, and reduced to figures of sudden, unpredictable encounters. The elven mother in Hrolf's saga Kraka, arriving at the king's door, embodies this shift. She is no longer a power to be worshipped, but a dangerous outsider demanding restitution. Her daughter Skuld's ability to command an army drawn indiscriminately from both Alpha and Vagar demonstrates how porous the boundaries had become in the later literary imagination. This blending of categories reflects the fading of the elves from active religious powers into the generalized supernatural background of the heroic sagas. The attestation of this decline provides crucial historiographical context, allowing researchers to track the long, slow process by which a deeply venerated power class was gradually written out of existence. They are no longer the entities that stand beside the gods. They are the forgotten powers waiting in the winter snow.